Okay, let's discuss section 1 of chapter 1, which puts out the question for us, what is science? Well, it's a described often as a way of knowing. And what we mean by that is it's a way to understand the world. That's supposed to represent the world, United States, South America. It's supposed to a way of understanding the world that's different from, say, mythology or religion. It's another way of understanding the world. Um, and the goals of science are to determine the way in which the world works, and essentially to try to elucidate where's my marker? What the natural laws are by which the world functions or operates. Um, as we'll describe in more detail in a moment, the way we go about trying to figure out how the world operates is through the scientific method. Now, of course, although science has advanced quite a bit, there is still a lot to learn. Um, and our old ways of understanding the world give way to new ways. For example, in a very simple example, one time we thought, excuse me, that the world was flat, but then it was determined that the world is not flat, that it is indeed round. And so science is a process that advances and often alters the way we thought things operated. Um, so science does um, change. The way we think about the world changes through time. But ideally, what it does is work towards giving us the correct way of understanding the world, or a better way of understanding. That is, science should advance through time. Um, now, gonna, there's always going to be a certain amount of uncertainty with what we learn through science and the way we understand the world. And we never really prove anything with science. We tend to demonstrate things beyond a reasonable doubt. Um, Now, when we do that, when we explain things quite thoroughly, they can become what we know as theories. And in science, theories are ideas that are supported by a great deal of evidence. If you have something that is demonstrated or supported by a lot of evidence and applies really under all circumstances, then these can be known these are known as scientific laws. Laws like the law of conservation of matter or the laws of thermodynamics. These are ideas that are pretty much set in stone. Okay, scientific method. First, it starts with observation. We see a situation like we have here. In one location, the grass is relatively short, and in the other one, it's relatively tall. And this observation leads to a question. Now, we may do some initial research investigating of, okay, what could possibly be doing this, which leads us to an inference or a thought of, maybe it's this. Maybe it's a lack of nutrients that's causing A to be shorter. And so we form a hypothesis. Hypotheses are often in the form of if then statements. We would say, for example, if I add extra nutrients to a plot of land, then the grass will grow taller. Okay? So, once we have our hypothesis, we can develop an experiment. And ideally, we're going to have a controlled experiment. That is, we're going to have a experiment with the control group, that is some individuals, or in this case little plots of land that do not receive the extra fertilizer. They're sort of our baseline. And then we have our experimental treatment, or our experimental group, that does receive the excess, or does receive the fertilizer. Now ideally we'll also have some replication in our experiment. That is, we'll have several plots of land that are the control and several little plots of land that are the experimental group. This replication gives us hopefully greater accuracy and strength in our results. Of course, we monitor our plots of land over time. We collect some data on how the grass is growing by, in this case, just simply measuring the height of the plants and see how they're doing. Analyze that data and reach some conclusions about our experiment. So in this case, we've graphed the data, and we can see we have this line graph here, and we've got the plants that were in the control plots plotted out here over time, and presumably we would have measured at several points in time. Then we've got our experimental treatments that receive the fertilizers over time. And so you can see this shows pretty clearly that the fertilizer does indeed make a difference, and that those plants and those treatments do grow more and reach greater height. So from this, we might conclude that our hypothesis is correct. And so in our conclusions, we do say whether or not the data supports the hypothesis. The data may or they may not. If they don't, that's not a big deal. You get a negative result. It's a result nonetheless. All right, what's a good way to graph data? Of course, there are several ways you can do this. As we show here, a line graph. And line graphs are good when you have, they're good in particular when you have data that's sort of changing continuously over time. Okay, that is, you don't have discrete entities. These plants are being followed over time, and so a line graph is really good there. Bar graph or histograms are good when you're looking at discrete entities at particular moments in time. So for example, we might be looking at, I don't know, males, that's supposed to be male, M-A-L-E, and females, and how they respond to some particular medication, say. And so we have our response here, and we would graph out the difference in their response. And so these males and females are distinct groups. There's really no connection between them, so graphing them with a line graph does not really make sense because it implies some kind of connection between them and some continuous change, which is not the case here, so that would not work. Pie graphs are appropriate when you're looking at some groupings that sum to 100%. And let me give you a good example from environmental science, say. Okay, so we're going to look at trash, and we can categorize trash into different kinds: paper, metal, glass, and we'll say food and yard waste. So of course you have the total amount of trash that is being generated, but we can divide it into particular subcategories. And so we can see, for example, 25% is the food and yard waste, 25% is glass in this case, about 30% is paper, and 20% is metal. They would sum to 100, but the pie chart shows us in a nice, succinct manner the categories, which proportion of the total they comprise. We tend not to use those as much as we use line and bar graphs. A good graph will, of course, be labeled. The X and Y axis will be labeled with what they represent. You'll also have the units there, in time, whether it's seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks, whatever the case. You have to let your reader know what the units are. And if your graph has, in this case, multiple lines, you have to label those lines to let us know which is which. So you have to make sure those graphs are labeled. Oh, and also, when you have something like time continuously, say you might have weeks, and you might have them even labeled. So we sampled in week 1, and week 2, and week 3, 4, 5, etc. Excuse me. You want to make sure those are equally spaced out. You would not obviously do it like this, 3, 4, 5. That would not make sense. You want to have them equally spaced out on your axis. Okay, so to summarize with this endeavor we know as science, it begins with questions that we derive from observations, from some initial investigation. We construct hypotheses, these educated guesses. We devise experiments with control groups ideally, and replication, get some results, analyze those results, and from the results conclude whether or not our hypothesis is, quote, true or supported by the data, or if our hypothesis is not supported by the data. Either result is fine, and you would report those results. Now, if your hypothesis was not supported by the data, then you would most likely want to rethink the experiment and revise your hypothesis, and ideally reach a hypothesis that the results support and that better explain this observation and this question we have. And so science is a process that can sort of happen many times when trying to answer a question. In fact, it pretty much always does. Any one experiment is unlikely to really definitively answer your question. You often have to do multiple experiments several times. Okay, there you go, section 1.1.